In France this week, at least 40 people went looking for relief from the heat and drowned trying to find it. In Spain, in just 4 days, an estimated 212 people may have been killed by the heat alone. Across Europe, more than 100 million people endured a single day above 35 degrees Celsius, and the World Health Organization has called it a health emergency. And on the other side of the Atlantic, the United States is walking into a furnace of its own. But here is what almost no one is telling you. The number on the thermometer is hiding the real danger, and the true line of human survival is closer than science ever believed. If this matters to you the way it matters to me, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Sky Lab, where we follow the sky and the warnings it sends every single day. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and whether this heat has reached your corner of the world yet. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The thermometer is lying to you. Right now, as you watch this, more than 100 million people across Europe are living through a single day in which the air around them climbed above 35 degrees Celsius. And on that same day, on the other side of the Atlantic, roughly 170 million people across the United States are bracing for a wall of heat that forecasters are calling the most dangerous of the year. 2 continents, 1 moment in time, and almost everywhere you look, the official records that are supposed to stand for decades are being broken, not at the height of summer, not in the dead heat of late July, but here, in the last week of June, before summer has even truly started. In France, the National Weather Service recorded a temperature of 44.3 degrees Celsius. To translate that for anyone watching in the United States, that is just under 112 degrees Fahrenheit, and it is not a regional record or a monthly record. It is the hottest temperature ever measured anywhere in mainland France in the entire history of French record keeping. In southern Spain, a station in a town called Andújar hit 45.1 degrees Celsius, which is a hair over 113 degrees Fahrenheit. In the United Kingdom, a country that most people associate with grey skies and drizzle, the temperature reached around 38 degrees Celsius, just touching 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and in doing so it shattered the record for the hottest June day that Britain has ever experienced, a record that had stood since the summer of 1976. And notice how these records are falling, because the manner matters as much as the fact. A record that creeps up by 1/10 of a degree is one thing, but Britain did not nudge past its old June record. It obliterated a mark that had stood for nearly 50 years since 1976, a year that lives in British memory as the legendary hot summer, the one older generations still talk about. An entire country's idea of the hottest June imaginable, formed over half a century, was simply erased in an afternoon. France did not break a regional record or a monthly one. It set the highest temperature in the entire span of national record keeping, a ceiling for the whole country, in June. When records fall by these kinds of margins, in these kinds of months, it is a sign that you are not watching ordinary variation. You are watching the baseline itself move, the whole range of what is possible shifting upward beneath your feet, and every one of these numbers is attached to a person. Behind the figure of 101 million Europeans above 35 degrees are 101 million individual afternoons of suffering, of labourers trying to finish a shift, of parents trying to keep children cool, of the elderly sitting very still in darkened rooms, waiting for a night that will not bring the relief it is supposed to. We're going to spend real time on those people later, on the rising count of the dead, because the human cost of this event is already severe and still climbing. But I want you to carry the human scale with you from the very start, so that none of these numbers stay abstract. Every record on every map is being paid for by somebody. These are the numbers that are making headlines. These are the numbers scrolling across the bottom of every news broadcast. And here is the thing I need you to understand before we go any further, because it is the idea that this entire video is built around. Those numbers, the ones on the thermometer, the ones everyone is quoting, are not the numbers that actually decide whether a heatwave lives or dies, whether it merely makes you uncomfortable or whether it kills you in a matter of hours. The air temperature is, in a very real sense, lying to you. It is telling you a story that is far gentler than the truth. There is another number, a number most people have never heard of. That is the real measure of how deadly heat becomes. Scientists call it the wet bulb temperature, and it is the single most important concept you will learn today. It is the number that determines the precise point at which the human body can no longer keep itself alive, no matter how much water you drink, no matter how much shade you find, no matter how still you sit. And the most unsettling part, the part that almost nobody's talking about, is that the research community has recently discovered that this lethal line sits lower and closer to ordinary conditions than science believed for the better part of a century. I want you to hold on to that, because we are going to come back to it again and again. The danger is not where you have been told it is. The danger is closer, but let us start with what is actually happening, because the scale of it is genuinely difficult to take in. This is not a heat wave in the way you might normally picture one, a hot spell baking a single city or a single country for a few days. What is unfolding right now is better understood as one enormous event spread across the entire Northern Hemisphere, two halves of the same machine running at the same time. Over Western Europe, a dome of high pressure has parked itself and refused to move, trapping hot air, compressing it, heating it further day after day after day. Over the central and eastern United States, a second dome of high pressure is doing exactly the same thing. These are not two separate stories that happen to be occurring at the same time by coincidence. They are two lobes of a single, hemisphere-wide pattern in the river of air that circles the planet, and we will get into exactly why that river has buckled the way it has, because that mechanism is the reason this keeps happening and the reason it is going to get worse. For now, just sit with the geography of it. In France, the heat was so widespread that 49 of the country's 96 mainland departments, more than half the nation, were placed under the highest level of heat warning the French system has. Hundreds of schools were closed or sent their children home early because the buildings themselves had become unsafe. In Italy, the highest tier of heat alert was placed on 16 cities at once, including Rome, Milan, Florence, Turin and Verona, a roll call of the country's great urban centres, all flashing red on the same map. In Spain, in Portugal, in Britain, the alerts stacked one on top of another until the map of Europe looked less like a weather forecast and more like a warning siren. The World Health Organization did something it does not do lightly. It called this event a health emergency. And to put a number on why an organization like that would reach for language that severe, consider this single statistic. The World Health Organization estimates that heat has killed roughly 200,000 people across Europe over the past 4 years. 200,000. That is not a projection about some distant future. That is the recent past, the body count that extreme heat has already quietly run up across a wealthy, developed, air-conditioned continent. And it is a number that barely registers in the public imagination, because heat does its killing in a way that hurricanes and earthquakes never do. It is invisible, it is slow, it does not knock down buildings, it simply stops hearts, one at a time, in bedrooms and care homes and parked cars, and most of the time the cause of death gets written down as something else. That is the deception at the centre of this whole subject, and it is why I keep saying the thermometer is lying to you. We have built our entire intuition about heat around the wrong measurement. We look at the forecast, we see a number, we decide whether it sounds dangerous, and we are almost always wrong because the number we are looking at leaves out the one factor that matters most. To understand why, we have to understand how your body actually keeps you alive on a hot day, and what happens in the precise moment that it can no longer do its job. I want you to really picture the simultaneity of it, because that is the part that breaks your intuition. At the exact same hour that a farmer in southern Spain is watching the thermometer climb toward 45 degrees, a commuter in New York City is stepping off a train into air thick enough to swim through, and a grandmother in a top-floor apartment in Rome is sitting in a room that has not cooled below 30 degrees in days. Portugal logged 42.7 degrees Celsius at a town called Pinhão, which is nearly 109 degrees Fahrenheit. The same dome of heat that did that to Portugal is part of the same hemispheric pattern that pushed Italy to place its highest alert on 16 major cities at once. These are not coincidences stacked on top of each other. They are symptoms of a single condition, the way a fever shows up in your forehead and your hands and your chest all at the same time, because the thing driving it is not local, it is systemic. The patient, in this case, is the entire Northern Hemisphere. And the fact that two of the planet's most heavily populated regions are running this fever at the very same moment, weeks ahead of schedule, is not the kind of coincidence the atmosphere produces by chance. It is the kind of thing that happens when the underlying circulation of the whole hemisphere has shifted into a state that pins heat in place across thousands of miles at once. When you see the same extraordinary event break out simultaneously on opposite sides of an ocean, The correct instinct is not to treat them as two stories. It is to go looking for the single cause large enough to drive both, and that cause is exactly what the rest of this video is going to uncover. And the way this heat kills is precisely what makes it so easy to underestimate. When a wildfire roars through a town, you see the flames and the smoke and the ash, and your body floods with the appropriate fear. When a river bursts its banks, you watch the water rise and you understand instantly and instinctively that you are in danger. Heat offers none of that. Heat is silent. It is invisible. It produces no roar, no flood, no debris field. It simply raises the temperature of the air a few degrees past a line you cannot see, and then it waits, and over hours and days it reaches into the bodies of the most vulnerable people around you and quietly stops them from working. The danger of heat is inversely proportional to how dangerous it looks, and a heat wave that produces a postcard blue sky and bright sunshine can be, by the numbers, one of the deadliest events a region will face all year. There is a reason I keep using the word fever, and it is not just a figure of speech. A fever is what happens when a system's core temperature is pushed past the narrow band in which it can function, and that is happening at two scales at once in this story. It is happening to the planet whose patterns are running hot and stuck, and it is happening one body at a time to the people caught underneath those patterns whose own core temperatures are being pushed toward the same kind of failure. The bridge between those two scales, the thing that connects a buckled jet stream high in the atmosphere to a heart that stops beating in a Spanish bedroom, is the wet bulb temperature. It is the single concept that lets you read this entire event correctly, and almost nobody outside of climate science has ever had it explained to them properly. So that is where we are going next. Because once you understand wet bulb temperature, once you really understand it, you will never look at a summer forecast the same way again. You will see the hidden number underneath the obvious one, and you will start to ask the question that the scientists studying this are now asking with a real edge of fear in their voices, which is this. If the records are already falling this hard, this early, and if the true limit of human survival is lower than we thought, then how much room is actually left before parts of this planet cross a line from which, for hours at a time, there is simply no coming back? Part 2. The number that decides who lives. To understand why a single hidden number can mean the difference between discomfort and death, you have to start with a fact about your own body that is so ordinary you have probably never thought about it. You are at this very moment running a furnace. Every cell in your body is burning fuel to keep you alive, and that process generates heat constantly, whether you are sprinting or sleeping. Your core temperature has to stay within an extraordinarily narrow band, right around 37 degrees Celsius, which is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Push it just a few degrees above that, and your proteins begin to unravel, your organs begin to fail, and you die. Your body has spent millions of years evolving one primary tool to prevent that from happening, and that tool is sweat. Here is how it works. When you get too hot, you release water onto the surface of your skin. That water then evaporates, and evaporation is the secret. When liquid water turns into vapor, it carries energy away with it, pulling heat directly off your body and dumping it into the air. This is the same reason you feel cold when you step out of a swimming pool on a breezy day. The water on your skin is evaporating, and as it leaves, it steals your warmth. Your entire survival in hot weather depends on this one trick. As long as your sweat can evaporate, you can cool yourself, and you can endure temperatures that would otherwise cook you. But evaporation has a catch, and the catch is everything. Water can only evaporate into air that has room to accept more moisture. If the air around you is already saturated, already heavy with water vapor, then your sweat has nowhere to go. It sits on your skin. It drips off you uselessly, and the cooling stops. This is why humidity is so much more dangerous than most people realize. A dry 110-degree day in the desert can be survivable, because your sweat evaporates furiously and keeps you cool. A humid 95-degree day in a swamp can kill you, because the same sweat just sits there doing nothing, while your core temperature climbs and climbs. This is exactly what the wet bulb temperature measures. It is, in the simplest terms, the temperature you get when you combine the heat of the air with the moisture already in it, and it tells you how much cooling power evaporation still has left. Scientists measure it in a beautifully simple way. They take an ordinary thermometer, they wrap its bulb in a wet cloth, and they blow air across it. The water in the cloth evaporates and cools the thermometer down. exactly the way sweat is supposed to cool you, and the temperature it settles at is the wet bulb temperature. If the air is dry, the wet cloth cools dramatically, and the wet bulb reading is far below the actual air temperature. If the air is already soaked with humidity, the cloth barely cools at all, and the wet bulb reading climbs frighteningly close to the air temperature itself. That wet thermometer is, in effect, a tiny model of your own sweating skin. Whatever it reads is the best your body can possibly do. It helps to understand that heat does not kill in a single step, but in a sequence. A staircase the body descends as its cooling fails. The first stage is heat exhaustion, and most people have felt at least the edge of it. The heart races, the skin goes clammy. You feel dizzy and nauseous and weak. Your body screaming at you that something is wrong while it still has the capacity to warn you. Heat exhaustion is the warning shot. If you cool down at that point, you recover. But if the heat keeps winning, you cross into the second stage, and the second stage is heat stroke, and heat stroke is a true medical catastrophe. The body's core temperature climbs past about 40 degrees Celsius, and at that point the cooling system has not just failed, it has begun to break down in a way that feeds on itself. Strangely, the sweating often stops entirely. The skin can go hot and dry, and the brain, which is exquisitely sensitive to heat, begins to malfunction, producing confusion, slurred speech, bizarre behavior, and eventually unconsciousness. What is actually happening inside the body at that point is the thing the wet bulb limit is really describing. Heat, past a certain level, physically damages the machinery of life. The proteins that do the work in every one of your cells begin to lose their shape, the way an egg white turns from clear to solid in a hot pan, and once they change shape, they stop functioning. Your cells begin to leak and die. Your organs, one by one, start to fail. The kidneys, the liver, the heart. The lining of your gut breaks down and releases toxins into your blood. It becomes a cascade, each failure triggering the next, and past a certain point it cannot be reversed, even with the best medical care in the world. This is what it means to die of hypothermia, and it is why the 6-hour figure at the wet bulb limit is so chilling. It is not that you are uncomfortable for 6 hours. It is that, once your cooling fails completely, this cascade begins, and it runs to its conclusion. Now, we arrive at the line. For decades, scientists settled on a specific wet bulb temperature as the theoretical limit of human survival, the point past which the cooling system fails completely. That number is 35 degrees Celsius, which is 95 degrees Fahrenheit, on the wet bulb scale. And I want to be very precise about what crossing that line actually means, because it is genuinely one of the most chilling ideas in all of climate science. When the wet bulb temperature reaches 35 degrees, the air is so hot and so saturated that your sweat can no longer evaporate at all. Your body's only cooling mechanism shuts down entirely. At that point, it does not matter how healthy you are. It does not matter if you're a marathon runner in peak condition. It does not matter if you're sitting perfectly still in the shade with a cold drink in your hand. Your core temperature begins to rise slowly but relentlessly, and within roughly 6 hours, you die of hypothermia. 6 hours for a perfectly healthy adult, doing everything right. To translate that 35-degree wet bulb limit into conditions you can actually picture, here is what it looks like in the real world. It is reached when the air hits 95 degrees Fahrenheit at 100% humidity. Or, if the air is drier, it is reached when the temperature climbs to about 115 degrees Fahrenheit at 50% humidity. Those combinations sound extreme, and historically, they were vanishingly rare, which is exactly why this threshold was treated as a kind of distant theoretical horror. A line that the planet only flirted with in the very hottest, most humid corners of the Earth, and only for a few minutes at a time. It is worth slowing down on why drinking water cannot save you past this point, because that is the part people find hardest to accept. Surely the thinking goes, if you stay hydrated, you can keep sweating, and if you keep sweating, you can keep cooling. But that logic contains a hidden assumption, which is that the sweat is actually doing something once it leaves your body. Past the wet bulb limit, it is not. You can drink gallons. Your sweat glands can keep dutifully pushing water onto your skin, but if that water cannot evaporate, it simply runs off you, and not a single bit of heat goes with it. Hydration keeps you from dying of dehydration. It does nothing whatsoever to stop you from dying of the heat itself, because the cooling pathway, the evaporation, has been physically shut off by the moisture in the air. This is the cruel trick at the centre of wet bulb death. your body keeps trying its one strategy, pouring out water, working harder and harder, and the harder it works, the more useless the effort becomes. And there is a second cost hiding in that effort, one that explains why the heart is so often the organ that finally fails. To cool itself, your body does not only sweat, it also pushes enormous volumes of blood out toward the surface of your skin, trying to dump heat through the skin into the air. That means your heart has to work dramatically harder, pumping blood to the periphery while still supplying your brain and your organs, all while you are losing fluid and your blood is thickening. For a young, strong cardiovascular system, that is a strain. For an old or damaged heart, it is a load it may not be able to carry, and at some point it simply stops. This is why so many heat deaths get recorded as heart attacks. The official cause of death is cardiac. The real cause of death is a wet bulb temperature that forced a tired heart to do the impossible. You can build an intuition for wet bulb values once you start translating them into ordinary experience. A pleasant dry summer day might have a wet bulb temperature down in the teens of degrees Celsius, which is why it feels comfortable, your sweat evaporating freely and keeping you cool with ease. A genuinely oppressive, sticky, miserable day, the kind where your shirt clings to you and you feel like you cannot breathe, might push the wet bulb into the high 20s. At that point you're already in conditions where heavy outdoor labour becomes dangerous, where athletes start collapsing, where the body is straining to keep up. The jump from there to the 30 and 35 degree range is not a jump in comfort. It is a jump across the line from straining to failing, from a body that is coping to a body that has run out of options. That is the version of the story that has been told for years, and if it ended there, it would already be unsettling enough. But it does not end there, and this is where the subject takes a turn that genuinely alarmed me when I first looked into it. Because that famous 35-degree line, the one in every textbook, the one quoted in every documentary, turns out to have a problem. It was never actually measured on real human beings. It came out of physics, out of equations on a chalkboard, a calculation of where, in theory, the cooling system ought to fail. And when scientists finally decided to put real people into chambers and find out where the line truly sits, the answer they got back was not 35 degrees. The answer they got back was lower, in some cases much lower. And that single discovery changes everything about how close we actually are to the edge, because if the real limit is lower than 35, then the conditions that can kill a human being are not some exotic event confined to the Persian Gulf. They are conditions that can occur far more often, in far more places, including places that are sweltering right now. So the obvious question becomes, how much lower is it, and who exactly did the science say is in danger first? That is what we are going to look at next, and the answer is the reason the title of this video is what it is. Part 3. The line is closer than we thought. For a long time, the 35-degree wet bulb threshold had a strange status in science. It was universally cited and almost never tested. It sat in papers and textbooks as a clean, authoritative figure, a line drawn from thermodynamics, from the pure physics of how heat moves between a body and the air. The logic seemed airtight. If your skin sits at about 35 degrees, and the wet bulb temperature of the air also reaches 35 degrees, then there is no temperature difference left to drive heat away from you, and so cooling must stop. It was elegant, it was simple, and it had one enormous weakness, which is that a real human body is not a simple physics problem. It is a living, imperfect, gloriously complicated machine, and the only way to find out how it truly behaves is to test it. So that is what a team of researchers at Pennsylvania State University set out to do, in a project that has quietly reshaped how scientists think about the limits of human survival. They brought young, healthy volunteers into a specialized environmental chamber, a room where they could control the temperature and the humidity with precision. They had each person swallow a tiny telemetry capsule that would report their true core temperature from the inside. Then they slowly, carefully raised the heat and the humidity, watching for the exact moment when each person's core temperature stopped holding steady and began its unstoppable climb. That moment, the point where the body loses the fight, is what scientists call the critical environmental limit, and it is the real-world equivalent of the wet bulb death line. What they found should be far more famous than it is. For young, healthy adults, the people most able to withstand heat, the critical wet bulb temperature was not 35 degrees. In hot, humid conditions, it averaged closer to 30.5 degrees Celsius. Let me say that again because the gap is enormous. The theoretical limit was 35. The measured limit in the strongest, healthiest people was around 30.5. That is a difference of several degrees, and when you're talking about the edge of human survival, a few degrees is not a rounding error. A few degrees is the difference between a heatwave being uncomfortable and a heatwave being fatal. The research, including a major study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, found survivability limits spread across a range, roughly 26 to 34 degrees for young adults depending on conditions, and lower still, roughly 22 to 34 degrees for older adults. Hold on to that detail about older adults, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. The people most likely to die in a heatwave are not young and healthy. They are elderly. They have weaker hearts, less efficient sweating, medications that interfere with temperature regulation, and bodies that have simply lost some of their ability to cope. And for them, the research suggests the lethal line can sit as low as the low 20s on the wet bulb scale. A wet bulb temperature in the low 20s of degrees Celsius does not sound dangerous at all. It sounds like a pleasant summer afternoon. And yet for a frail 80-year-old, sustained over enough hours, it can be the beginning of the end. This is why the death tolls from heat waves are dominated by the old, and why those deaths so often happen not in some apocalyptic 120-degree extreme, but in conditions the rest of us would barely flag as dangerous. One detail from the research deserves special attention because it quietly demolishes the comfort most of us take from being fit and healthy. The volunteers who broke at around 30.5 degrees were not frail. They were young, healthy adults, chosen precisely because they represent the strong end of the human range, the people best equipped to survive heat. If the strongest among us begin to fail in the low 30s on the wet bulb scale, then the idea that personal fitness is a reliable shield against extreme heat collapses. Being young and healthy buys you some margin, yes, but it does not lift you to the old, falsely high 35-degree line. It does not make you invincible, and it certainly does nothing for the much larger population, the elderly, the chronically ill, the very young, whose limits sit far lower still. The research replaced a single comforting number that seemed to apply to everyone with a sobering spread of numbers, a range of vulnerability, with almost no one actually sitting up at the old reassuring threshold, and a great many people sitting frighteningly far below it. And the range itself carries a hard lesson, because it means there is no single safe number to point to, no clean line below which everyone can relax. Two people standing in the exact same hot, humid air can be in completely different danger, one merely uncomfortable and the other approaching collapse depending on their age, their health, their medications, their history. This is part of why heat is so treacherous and so easy to dismiss. The strong person standing next to the vulnerable one feels fine and concludes the conditions are fine, while the vulnerable one is quietly being pushed past their limit. The absence of a single visible threshold lets the healthy majority talk themselves out of taking the heat seriously, right up until it is the people around them who start to fall. This is the moment where the title of this video stops being a phrase and becomes a literal, scientific statement. The heat wave hitting the world right now is far worse than you think, and it is worse in a very specific way. It is worse because the metric everyone is watching, the air temperature, hides the real threat. And because the real threat, the wet bulb line, sits lower and closer to everyday conditions than science believed for generations. We spent decades reassuring ourselves with a number that was too high. We told ourselves the deadly line was at 35, way out at the edge of the possible, and the bodies of real people, measured in a laboratory, told us the line is closer than that. The margin of safety we thought we had was, in part, an illusion. And here is the truly sobering implication. We have all been treating wet bulb catastrophe as a problem for the future, something that climate models warn will arrive in the second half of this century in a few unlucky regions. But if the true survival limit is several degrees lower than the textbook figure, then the timeline moves up. The dangerous conditions are not waiting for the 2050s. For the most vulnerable people among us, the elderly, the sick, the very young, lethal heat stress can be reached today in this current event, in cities across 2 continents, at wet bulb temperatures that would never have triggered the old alarm. The future arrived early, and we were measuring it with the wrong ruler. There is a distinction the researchers draw that makes this even more sobering, and it is the difference between survivability and what they call livability. Survivability is the hard limit. the point past which a healthy person dies within hours. But long before you reach the line where heat kills you outright, you cross a much lower line where heat stops you from doing anything at all. Livability is the threshold past which you cannot work, cannot function, cannot maintain a normal life, where the only rational response is to stop everything and shelter. And that livability line sits far below the survival line, so even in places that never quite reach the lethal wet bulb threshold, the new science says that ordinary life, outdoor work, school, commerce, simply being a functioning human being outdoors, becomes impossible at temperatures we used to consider merely uncomfortable. The damage does not begin at the moment of death. It begins long before, in the slow shutting down of everything people need to do to survive. Think about who actually populates the most vulnerable end of that range, because it changes how you read every heat warning from now on. It is not an abstract average human. It is the 80-year-old widow living alone on the top floor of a building with no air conditioning, on medication for her blood pressure that happens to interfere with her body's ability to regulate temperature. It is the outdoor labourer who cannot simply choose not to work. It is the infant whose body has a harder time managing heat and who cannot tell anyone what is wrong. It is the person with heart disease, with diabetes, with any of a dozen common conditions that quietly lower the temperature at which their body gives out. For all of these people, and there are tens of millions of them in every affected region, the lethal line is not the textbook 35. It is somewhere down in the range where the rest of us are still calling it a warm afternoon. The new research did not just lower a number on a chart. It revealed that a huge invisible population is living much closer to the edge than anyone admitted, and that this current heat wave is pressing directly on exactly those people. There is a deeper reason the empirical numbers came out lower than the theory, and it tells you something important about the limits of pure calculation. The theoretical 35-degree limit assumed an idealized body, perfectly efficient, with skin sitting at a convenient temperature and heat moving cleanly from the core to the surface to the air. But a real body is messier than that. Real skin under heat stress is often warmer than the idealized model assumed, which means the temperature gap that drives cooling closes sooner than the theory predicted. Real cooling involves the heart straining to move blood. Real sweat does not evaporate with perfect efficiency, and real human variation means some people fail well before others. When you put actual people in the chamber, all of that messiness showed up as a lower limit, a real number rather than an idealized one. And the lesson is humbling. We had been protecting ourselves with a figure derived from a clean equation, and the clean equation was too generous to us. The living, breathing, imperfect body breaks first. This has enormous and underappreciated consequences for the warning systems we rely on. The heat index numbers you see on a forecast, the official thresholds that decide when a warning gets issued, were all built on top of assumptions about where danger begins, and if the true line of danger sits lower than those assumptions, then our warnings are systematically calibrated to go off too late. A system designed to sound the alarm as conditions approach an old, too high threshold will by definition stay quiet through conditions that the new science says are already lethal for the vulnerable. It means that across the world, right now, there are official forecasts describing conditions as merely hot, in places where, for the frail and the old, those same conditions are already deadly. The gap between the old number and the real number is not just an academic curiosity. It is built into the very tools we use to decide who gets warned and when, and that gap is being paid for in lives. Now, I want to be careful and honest here, because this channel does not deal in panic for its own sake. The most extreme wet bulb readings, the true 35-degree death zone, are still rare even now, and we will talk about exactly where on earth they have actually occurred. But the lesson of the new research is not that everything is fine because we have not all hit 35. The lesson is the opposite. It is that danger begins well below the number we were watching for, that it begins quietly, that it begins with the people we are least likely to notice. And it raises a question that turns this from an abstract scientific story into something with a face and a name. If the line is lower than we thought, and the heat is higher than ever, then who is dying right now, in this exact heat wave, while the rest of the world looks at the thermometer and decides it is merely a hot week? That is where we have to go next, because the answer is already being counted and it is rising by the day. Part 4. The body count nobody wants to read. A few days ago on this channel we looked at the forecast and told you what was about to hit Europe. We laid out the maps, the pressure systems, the warnings that were flashing across the continent, and we said the heat that was coming had forecasters genuinely frightened. I want to return to that now, because what was a forecast then is a reality today, and the reality has turned out to be worse than the forecast dared to predict. The records we said might fall have fallen, and the human cost we worried about has begun to arrive, in numbers that are difficult to read and harder to forget. Let us start in France, because France tells the story of this heatwave in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. When the heat became unbearable, people did the most natural thing in the world. They went looking for water. They went to rivers, to lakes, to the sea, to anywhere they could escape the furnace of the air, and across the country, again and again, they drowned. As of the latest counts, at least 40 people have died in the water in France during this heatwave, and many of them were young teenagers and people in their 20s, the strong and the healthy, the last people you would expect a heatwave to claim. They were not killed by the heat directly. They were killed trying to flee it. There is something almost unbearably cruel about that, about a disaster so relentless that the act of seeking relief from it becomes one of the leading ways it kills you, and the water is only part of it. Beyond the drownings, France has recorded at least 18 deaths directly attributed to the heat itself, and among them is a detail that I think will stay with anyone who hears it. 2 of the dead were children, left in a hot car. We will talk later about why a closed vehicle in this kind of heat becomes lethal so quickly, but for now I just want you to hold the human shape of that number. Not a statistic. 2 children. The night the heat peaked, France endured its hottest night since 1947, nearly 8 decades, and as we will see, the nights are not a footnote to a heat wave. The nights are where the real killing happens. Now look at Spain, because Spain shows you the part of the death toll that stays almost entirely hidden, the part the thermometer never shows and the headlines rarely capture. Spain has a system for tracking what scientists call excess mortality. The idea is simple and powerful. You look at how many people would normally be expected to die in a given week, based on years of historical data, and then you compare it to how many people actually died. The difference, the excess, is the fingerprint of an event like a heat wave, even when no individual death certificate says the word heat on it. And Spain's monitoring system estimated that in a span of just 4 days, from a Sunday to a Wednesday, 212 deaths could be linked to the heat. 212 in 4 days in one country. That is the invisible toll made visible. Those are people whose deaths will mostly be recorded as heart attacks, as strokes, as respiratory failure, as old age, the heat hiding behind a dozen other names. The Spanish Health Ministry had already reported that the month of May alone, before this June event even began, saw 101 heat-related deaths, the highest May figure since their records began. This is the thing about heat that makes it the quiet killer, the disaster that never gets the fear it deserves. When a hurricane comes ashore, we count the dead and we see the destruction, the flattened houses, the flooded streets. When the ground shakes and buildings fall, the catastrophe announces itself. But heat leaves no wreckage. It leaves only empty chairs, slightly more of them than there should be, scattered across a country, in apartments, and hospital wards and nursing homes, and unless someone is carefully counting the excess, the disaster passes almost unseen. This is precisely why the science of wet bulb temperature matters so much, because it is the tool that lets us understand why those chairs are empty. Those 212 people in Spain, those elderly Spaniards whose hearts gave out in the heat, did not need a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees to die. Remember what the new research told us. For older adults, the lethal line sits far lower. The heat that killed them would have looked, on a thermometer, like a number their grandchildren shrugged off. It is worth drawing the distinction that public health officials draw between direct and indirect heat deaths, because it explains why the early numbers we're seeing now are almost certainly an undercount of the eventual toll. A direct heat death is the obvious case, someone who collapses from heat stroke and whose death is immediately and unmistakably attributed to the heat. Those are the deaths that get reported in real time, the drownings, the obvious cases, but they are the minority. The far larger share of a heat wave's victims die indirectly, of heart attacks and strokes and respiratory failures that the heat pushed them into, but that get recorded under those other names. Those deaths do not show up in the daily tallies. They only emerge weeks later, when the statisticians compare the actual death count to the expected one, and find the grim surplus. So when you hear the current figures, the 40 in France, the 212 in Spain, understand that these are the early, visible tip of something larger. The full toll of this event will not be known for weeks, and when it is known, history tells us it will be far higher than anything being reported today. There is a particular and painful pattern in who dies during the social rituals of summer, and this event has already shown it. People do not stop living because it is hot. They still hold their gatherings, run their races, play their matches, attend their festivals. And again in heat waves, including this one, you see deaths at exactly these events, at amateur sporting matches, at outdoor gatherings, people who push their bodies in the heat because the calendar said it was a day for celebration or competition, not for hiding indoors. There is a tragic innocence to these deaths. The victims were not being reckless. They were doing the ordinary things people do in summer on days that looked, by the old standards, like ordinary summer days. The heat simply no longer plays by the old standards, and the rituals built for a cooler climate have quietly become dangerous. Spread the lens out across the whole continent, and the scale becomes almost incomprehensible. On a single day during this event, at least 101 million Europeans, more than the entire population of most countries on Earth, experienced air temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius at the same time. Red alerts, the highest tier of warning, remained in force simultaneously across France, Spain, Italy, and the United Kingdom. And presiding over all of it, the World Health Organization used that phrase I mentioned earlier, that it does not use casually, calling the situation a health emergency and reminding the world of the staggering figure that heat has killed an estimated 200,000 people across Europe in just the past 4 years. I want to pause on that 4-year figure one more time, because it reframes everything. We are not talking about a freak event without precedent. We're talking about the latest and one of the worst in a pattern that has already been killing people on an industrial scale year after year, while most of the world's attention was elsewhere. 200,000 deaths in 4 years is a war's worth of casualties inflicted by the weather on a continent with some of the best healthcare and infrastructure on the planet. And it is happening because of exactly the mismatch we have been describing between the danger people perceive when they look at a temperature and the danger that actually exists once you account for humidity, for the vulnerability of the human body, and above all for what happens when the heat refuses to release its grip even after the sun goes down. If you want to understand just how large this invisible toll can grow, you only have to look back to the summer of 2003, the event that still haunts European public health officials and that hangs over everything happening right now. That summer, a heatwave settled over the continent, and by the time the excess mortality was finally tallied, the death toll across Europe was estimated at more than 70,000 people. In France alone, nearly 15,000 people died, and the way they died is the part that matters for understanding today. They were overwhelmingly elderly. They were overwhelmingly alone. Many of them lived by themselves in apartments without cooling, with families away on the traditional August holidays, and they died quietly over a span of days, their bodies sometimes not discovered until well afterward. The morgues of Paris overflowed. Refrigerated warehouses had to be requisitioned to hold the dead, and almost none of those people would have shown up in a simple count of heat deaths, because their death certificates said heart failure, said respiratory distress, said old age. It took the cold mathematics of excess mortality to reveal that a single heat wave had killed the equivalent of a small city, that 2003 catastrophe is the reason Europe now has the warning systems, the red alerts, the heat action plans that are being activated right now. And yet here we are, with the alerts blazing and the systems running, and the bodies are still accumulating. That should tell you something sobering. Even a continent that learned the lesson of 2003 the hard way, that built an entire infrastructure to prevent it from happening again, is still losing people in large numbers because the underlying heat is climbing faster than the defences can keep up. The warnings are working, the plans are running, and the death toll is rising anyway, because you cannot fully outwarn an event of this magnitude. You can only reduce it at the edges. What ties 2003 to this week, and ties both of them to the wet bulb science we have been building toward, is the profile of who dies and why. It is not the strong who fall first. It is the old, the isolated, the medically fragile, the people whose personal survival line, as the new research showed us, sits far below the textbook threshold. They are dying in conditions that, on a thermometer, look survivable, and that is exactly the point. The thermometer says one thing, their bodies say another, and the gap between those two is measured in funerals. Because here is what almost everyone gets wrong about heat waves. We picture the danger as the blazing afternoon, the peak of the day, the sun directly overhead. We imagine that the threat fades when evening comes. But the data tells a different and far more disturbing story. The afternoon high is not what runs up the body count. The thing that fills those empty chairs, the true mechanism of mass death in a heat wave, is something quieter, something that happens in the dark, something that this current event is producing in record-breaking fashion across both Europe and America. To understand how this heat is really killing people, we have to talk about the nights. Part 5. The nights that never cool. Think about what a normal hot day is supposed to feel like. The temperature climbs through the morning, peaks in the afternoon, and then, as the sun goes down, it falls. The evening brings relief. The night brings recovery. This daily rise and fall is something the human body is deeply, evolutionarily adapted to. We are built to endure a hot afternoon precisely because we can count on a cool night to follow it. A window of hours in which our core temperature can settle, our hearts can slow, our overworked cooling systems can rest and reset before the next day's heat arrives. The night is not a pause in the danger. The night is the repair. Now imagine what happens when that repair never comes. Imagine a night where the temperature refuses to fall, where the darkness brings no relief, where the air at 3 a.m. is still hot enough to keep you sweating in your bed. Your body, which has been fighting the heat all day, never gets its recovery window. It goes into the next day already depleted, already stressed, already closer to the edge. And then the next day piles more heat on top of an organism that never got to recover from the last one. Do that for 2 days, 3 days, 5 days in a row, and you have a body that is being worn down relentlessly, with no chance to catch its breath. And eventually, especially in someone old or sick, something gives. The heart, working overtime to pump blood to the skin for cooling, simply fails. This is why heat researchers will tell you, almost unanimously, that the overnight low temperature is a better predictor of how many people a heatwave will kill than the daytime high. The days make you suffer. The nights are what kill you. And this current event is producing exactly the kind of nights that fill morgues. I told you that France just had its hottest night since 1947. Let that sink in. For nearly 80 years, France had not experienced overnight heat like this, and a hot night in a country where air conditioning is far from universal, where old stone apartments soak up the day's heat and radiate it back into bedrooms all night long, is a recipe for exactly the kind of slow, invisible mass death we've been describing. In Portugal, during the related heat, the country experienced what meteorologists call tropical nights, almost from one end of the nation to the other, nights where the temperature never dropped below 20 degrees Celsius. That number, 20 degrees overnight, is the line meteorologists use to flag a night as dangerously warm, and Portugal blew past it nationwide. The same lethal mechanism is now setting up across the United States, and this is where the two halves of our hemispheric story start to rhyme with each other. As the American heat dome builds, forecasters are warning that overnight low temperatures in some major metropolitan areas may not drop below 80 degrees Fahrenheit. 80 degrees in the middle of the night in a major American city. That is the warm night phenomenon in its most dangerous form, and it is especially deadly in cities because of something called the urban heat island effect. All that concrete and asphalt and brick that a city is built from absorbs heat all day long like a giant battery, and then releases it slowly through the night, keeping the urban core hotter than the surrounding countryside long after dark. So the very places with the most people, the dense urban centres, become the places where the nights are warmest and the danger is highest, and where the most vulnerable residents, the elderly living alone in apartments without air conditioning, are quietly pushed past their limits. There is a piece of human biology that makes warm nights even more insidious than they first appear, and it has to do with the rhythm your body runs on. Your core temperature is not constant through the day. It naturally rises and falls on a daily cycle, and it is designed to dip to its lowest point in the small hours of the night, in the deepest part of your sleep. That nightly dip is not incidental. It is when a great deal of the body's repair and recovery happens, and it depends on the surrounding air being cool enough to let your core temperature fall. When the night stays hot, that natural dip is blocked. Your body cannot shed the day's accumulated heat. your core stays elevated through the night, and the recovery that's supposed to happen simply does not. You wake, if you slept at all, already behind, already overheated, with no reserve left for the day ahead. And there is the matter of sleep itself, which warm nights steal. It is very hard to sleep when you're too hot, and a population deprived of sleep night after night during a prolonged heatwave is a population whose judgment, whose cardiovascular health, whose very resilience is being steadily eroded. Sleep deprivation alone strains the heart and clouds the mind, and when you stack it on top of the direct physical assault of the heat, you get bodies that are being attacked from two directions at once, unable to rest and unable to cool. This is part of why a long heat wave is so much deadlier than a single hot day. It is not just that the heat accumulates, it is that every system the body uses to cope, including sleep itself, is progressively taken away until there is nothing left to draw on. Now connect this back to the wet bulb science, because the nights are where that science becomes terrifyingly concrete. During the day, even in extreme heat, the air is often relatively dry, and sweat can still do some work. But at night, the temperature drops a little, while the humidity climbs, and the wet bulb temperature, that true measure of danger, can actually stay stubbornly high right through the darkness. The body's situation does not improve as much as the falling thermometer would suggest, because the humidity is rising to meet it. So a person lying awake in a hot apartment at 2 a.m, looking at a thermometer that reads a merely uncomfortable number, may actually be sitting in wet bulb conditions that are grinding down their cardiovascular system hour by hour. And if that person is elderly, if their personal survival line sits down in the low 20s where the research now places it, then a series of these nights is not an inconvenience. It is a sentence. History gives us a brutal case study of exactly this mechanism, and it happened not in Europe but in the United States, in the city of Chicago, in the summer of 1995. Over the course of about 5 days in July, a heatwave killed more than 700 people in that single city. And when researchers later dissected what had happened, the picture that emerged was a near-perfect illustration of everything we have been describing. The daytime temperatures were extreme, but it was the nights that did the killing, nights when the urban core stayed brutally hot and never let people recover. The victims were overwhelmingly elderly, poor, and alone, living in apartments without air conditioning, many of them too afraid of crime to open their windows or sleep on fire escapes, sealed inside ovens of their own homes. The city's morgue ran out of space and had to bring in refrigerated trucks to hold the bodies. It was a wet bulb and warm night massacre, decades before most people had ever heard either term, and it remains one of the deadliest weather events in modern American history, a thing that unfolded in silence in a major city while much of the country barely noticed. The lesson of Chicago, and the reason it matters so much for what is happening right now, is that the warm night is not just a meteorological curiosity. It is the specific physical condition that converts a heat wave from an uncomfortable event into a mass casualty event. And it interacts viciously with the infrastructure we depend on to survive. During exactly the kind of prolonged intense heat we are seeing now, electricity demand spikes as millions of air conditioners run flat out, and that surge can overload and bring down the power grid at the worst possible moment. When the power fails during a heat wave, air conditioning fails with it, and the very technology that millions of vulnerable people are relying on to stay below their personal survival line simply switches off. A blackout during a severe heat wave is not an inconvenience. It is potentially a death sentence delivered to everyone who is depending on a machine to keep them alive, and it tends to strike hardest in the densest, poorest, hottest parts of a city, the same neighbourhoods that the heat was already punishing most. This is why the warm nights now setting up across both Europe and America are so much more than a statistic about overnight temperatures. They are the mechanism. They are the part of the heat wave that actually fills the morgues. And the fact that this current event is breaking overnight records, France's hottest night since 1947, Portugal's nationwide tropical nights, the American forecast of city lows that will not fall below 80 degrees is the clearest possible signal that the death toll we have already seen is not the end of the counting, it is the beginning. This is the hidden engine of the death tolls we just walked through. The 40 deaths in France, the 212 in Spain, the steady accumulation across the continent are not mostly happening at the blazing peak of the afternoon. They are happening in the small hours, in the dark, in the nights that never cool, to people whose bodies finally could not take one more day without rest. And it is the reason this particular heat wave is so dangerous, because it is not a single hot day. It is a prolonged siege. Day after day, night after night, the pattern locked in place and refusing to move, giving no one a chance to recover. Which brings us to a question I have been dancing around and can no longer avoid. If this is a hemispheric event, if Europe and America are truly two halves of one machine, then we have spent a lot of time on Europe, and it is time to turn the camera around and look at what is bearing down on the United States right now. Because the American half of this story has its own records about to fall, its own cities about to cross lines they have not crossed in decades, and its own strange and revealing twist, a contradiction sitting right in the middle of the country that proves, better than any map, that all of this heat is being driven by a single broken pattern in the sky. Let us go to America. Part 6. America under the same sky. While Europe burns, the United States is walking into a furnace of its own, and the numbers attached to it are staggering in their reach. Forecasters are warning that a single heat dome, building across the central and eastern United States, will subject roughly 170 million Americans to dangerous heat in the days surrounding the 4th of July. 170 million people. That is more than half the country, all under the same dome of trapped superheated air, all at the same time. And just as in Europe this is not arriving in the depths of summer, it is arriving in late June, at the leading edge of the season, when records like these are not supposed to fall. The cities tell the story most vividly. Along the densely populated eastern corridor, forecasters expect temperatures to climb toward or even hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit in Washington, in Baltimore, in Philadelphia, and in New York City. And here is the detail that should make you sit up. For some of these places, this would be the first time in decades that they have seen triple-digit heat in the month of June. We are not talking about a typical hot summer day. We are talking about a city like Washington or Philadelphia, touching 100 degrees weeks before the calendar says it should be possible, joining its European cousins in setting records out of season. Further south, cities like Columbia, South Carolina, and Tallahassee, Florida, are forecast to tie or break their daily temperature records outright, pushing into the low 100s. Think about what a 100-degree reading in June actually represents for a city like Washington or New York, places with long and detailed climate records stretching back more than a century. For some of these cities, triple-digit heat in the month of June has not happened in decades, which means that across the whole living memory of most residents, it simply has not occurred. An entire population sense of what June is, what early summer feels like, what the season is capable of, is about to be rewritten in a single week. And that matters beyond the record books, because a population's preparedness is built on its memory. People who have never experienced June heat like this do not have the habits, the instincts, or in many cases the cooling infrastructure to deal with it. The buildings in these northern cities were designed for a cooler climate, many older homes and apartments built with heat retention in mind rather than heat rejection, and the people inside them have never had to take a June heat wave this seriously before. Novelty itself is a hazard, because the danger arrives in a form the local population has no muscle memory for. The vulnerability is not spread evenly across these cities either, and it tends to concentrate in exactly the places least equipped to cope. The hottest parts of any city are typically its densest, most paved, least green neighbourhoods, and those are very often its poorest. Wealthier areas tend to have more trees, more parks, more open space, all of which cool the local air, and more reliable access to air conditioning. Poorer neighbourhoods bake under more concrete with less shade and less cooling, so the urban heat island effect lands hardest on the residents, with the fewest resources to escape it. The map of who suffers most in an American heat wave often looks unsettlingly like the map of income, and the coming dome will trace that same cruel geography, pressing hardest on the people already living closest to the edge, and remember everything we just learned about the nights, because the American heat dome is built to deliver exactly the kind of warm nights that kill. In some metropolitan areas, the overnight low may not fall below 80 degrees Fahrenheit, denying millions of people the recovery window their bodies need. Layer on the humidity that the eastern United States is famous for, and you get heat index values, the American cousin of the wet bulb concept that combines heat and humidity into a single felt temperature, climbing to between 105 and 110 degrees across vast stretches of the country. In Miami, that index is expected to sit between 102 and 108. In the heat of Texas, around Dallas and Houston, similar brutal combinations of heat and moisture are stacking up. The official designation that forecasters are using for huge portions of the country is major to extreme heat risk, the top of their scale. That heat index figure deserves a moment, because it is the closest thing most Americans have to the wet bulb concept, and it is doing the same essential job. The heat index combines the air temperature with the humidity to tell you what the heat actually feels like to your body, which is another way of saying it accounts for how well your sweat can evaporate. When a forecaster says the temperature is 95 but the heat index is 110, what they are really telling you is that the humidity has crippled your cooling, so that your body is experiencing the heat as if it were 110. It is a softer, more familiar cousin of the wet bulb temperature, built for the evening news, but it is pointing at the very same truth. The thing that matters is not the raw temperature. It is the temperature plus the moisture, the combination that determines whether you can shed heat or not. And the American heartland has a peculiar feature that makes its humidity especially brutal, one that surprises people when they first learn about it. Across the vast farm country of the Midwest, the corn itself contributes to the misery. A mature field of corn releases enormous quantities of water vapor into the air through its leaves, a process so significant that meteorologists have a nickname for it: corn sweat. In the height of summer, over the great agricultural expanses, this floods the lower atmosphere with moisture and drives the humidity, and therefore the heat index and the wet bulb temperature, to dangerous levels even in places far from any ocean. So the same dome of heat settling over the central United States is sitting on top of a landscape that is actively pumping moisture into the air, loading the humidity side of the equation, pushing the felt temperature and the true danger higher than the raw thermometer would ever suggest. It is one more way the headline temperature understates the threat. I want to put one statistic in front of you that reframes how seriously we should take all of this, because in the United States especially, heat has a reputation problem. It is not dramatic. It does not make for terrifying footage the way a tornado or a hurricane does, and yet extreme heat is the number one weather-related cause of death in the United States. Not floods, not tornadoes, not hurricanes. Heat. In most years, heat kills more Americans than all of those other disasters combined. It is the deadliest weather phenomenon the country faces, and it does its killing in exactly the quiet, invisible, overnight, wet bulb-driven way we've been describing, which is precisely why it never gets the respect or the fear that its body count demands. The most dangerous weather in America is the weather that looks, on a forecast, like nothing more than a hot week. The timing of this American dome carries its own particular danger, because it is arriving wrapped around the 4th of July, one of the most heavily outdoor holidays on the entire American calendar. This is the week when tens of millions of people are planning to be outside, at barbecues, at parades, at beaches and lakes and fireworks displays, exerting themselves in the open air during exactly the window when the heat will be at its most extreme. The collision of a record heat dome with a holiday built around outdoor gathering is a recipe for a surge in heat illness, and it is precisely the kind of situation in which people who would never think of themselves as vulnerable, healthy adults pushing themselves in the heat suddenly find themselves in serious trouble. Heat does not only kill the frail. When the conditions are extreme enough and people exert themselves, it reaches the strong as well, and a holiday weekend is when the strong are most likely to be out in it. There is also the quiet threat to the systems holding everything together. A heat dome of this size drives electricity demand toward record levels as air conditioners strain across half the country, and grid operators across the affected regions will be watching their margins nervously. The hotter it gets, the harder the grid works, and the harder the grid works, the closer it edges toward the kind of failure that, as we saw, turns a survivable heatwave into a lethal one. Roads buckle, rail lines warp and slow. The infrastructure of modern life, all of it engineered for a climate that is slipping into the past, starts to strain and fail at the edges precisely when people need it most. This is the part of a heatwave that does not photograph well, the slow stress on the invisible scaffolding of civilization, and it is every bit as much a part of the danger as the temperature itself. But here is where the American side of this story delivers something genuinely revealing. A single strange fact that, once you see it, proves the entire argument of this video. While the central and eastern United States bakes under this historic dome of heat, something is happening on the other side of the country that should be impossible if these were just random hot spells. In the high peaks of the northern Rockies, in late June, it is snowing. Snow, accumulating snow on the mountaintops, in the same week that Washington and Philadelphia flirt with 100 degrees. To most people that sounds like a contradiction, like the weather has lost its mind. But it is not a contradiction at all. It is the smoking gun. It is the single clearest piece of evidence that everything we have been talking about, the heat in America, the heat in Europe, all of it, is being driven by one underlying cause. To understand why heat in the east and snow in the west are actually the same phenomenon, you have to picture the great river of air that flows around the entire northern hemisphere, high up in the atmosphere, the current we call the jet stream. Normally it flows in relatively smooth, fast waves from west to east. But sometimes it buckles. It develops enormous, exaggerated, slow-moving kinks, great looping waves that bulge far to the north in some places and plunge far to the south in others. Where the wave bulges north, it pulls a dome of hot air up from the tropics and parks it over a region, and you get a heat dome, the kind sitting over the eastern United States and over Europe right now. But right next to it, where the same wave plunges south, it drags cold air down from the Arctic, and you can get unseasonable cold, even late June snow on a mountaintop. The heat and the snow are not opposites fighting each other. They are two parts of the same giant, frozen-in-place wave in the sky. And that finally is the doorway into the deepest question of this whole story. Because if all of this, on two continents at once, is being driven by the jet stream buckling into these huge, stuck, slow-moving waves, then the questions that actually matter are these. Why is the jet stream doing this? Why does it seem to be happening more often? And is there a reason to believe that these stuck patterns, these hemispheric heat machines, are going to keep getting stronger and more frequent and more deadly in the years ahead? The answer touches the Arctic, the oceans, and the fundamental physics of a warming world, and it is the reason the scientists studying this are not just worried about today. They are worried about every summer that comes after it. Part 7. The Broken River in the Sky. To understand why the jet stream is buckling into these enormous stuck waves, you first have to understand what powers it in the first place. The jet stream exists because of a temperature difference, the contrast between the cold air of the Arctic and the warm air of the tropics. That difference in temperature creates a difference in pressure, and that pressure difference is the engine that drives the high-altitude winds, pushing them along in a fast, tight west-to-east flow. The bigger the temperature contrast between the pole and the equator, the stronger and the straighter the jet stream runs, like a powerful river confined to a narrow, fast channel. This is the key relationship, so hold it in your mind. A strong temperature contrast means a fast, straight jet. A weak temperature contrast means a slow, wandering one. Now here is the problem, and it sits at the absolute center of why heat waves are changing. The Arctic is not warming at the same pace as the rest of the planet. It is warming far faster, in some measurements 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. This phenomenon, known as Arctic amplification, is one of the most robust and well-documented findings in all of climate science. And as the Arctic heats up rapidly, the temperature contrast between the pole and the tropics shrinks. The cold end of the equation is getting warmer, so the difference is getting smaller. And if you remember the relationship we just established, a smaller temperature contrast means a weaker, slower, lazier jet stream. The river that used to run fast and straight now meanders. A slow, meandering jet stream is a jet stream that develops those huge, exaggerated north and south kinks we talked about, and crucially, it is a jet stream in which those kinks stop moving. A fast jet stream sweeps weather systems along, so a hot day is followed by a change. But when the jet slows down and the waves grow large, those waves can lock into place and sit there, sometimes for a week or two at a time. Meteorologists call this a blocking pattern, and it is the difference between a hot afternoon and a deadly prolonged heat dome. The heat does not move on, because the pattern steering it has ground to a halt. This is the mechanism behind the siege we're watching right now. The days and nights of relentless heat with no relief, on 2 continents at once. The same large, stuck wave that is baking Europe is part of the same hemispheric pattern that has parked a dome over America and dropped snow on the Rockies. Scientists have a name for these great looping kinks in the jet stream. They call them Rossby waves, and they are a normal natural feature of the atmosphere, the way the high-altitude winds meander north and south as they circle the globe. In a healthy atmosphere, these waves move along, progressing from west to east, so the weather they create keeps moving too. The trouble begins when the waves grow unusually large and then stall, and there is a particular phenomenon researchers have been studying in which these waves can lock into a stationary, repeating pattern around the entire hemisphere, a kind of standing wave that holds the same regions under the same conditions for weeks. When that happens, certain places get pinned under a ridge of high pressure, under the heat dome, while others get pinned under a trough, and nothing moves, and the heat simply builds and builds in the pinned locations. This is the mechanism that turns a hot spell into a deadly siege, and there is real scientific concern that a warming, destabilized atmosphere is making these stuck, resonant wave patterns more common. You can actually see the fingerprint of this stuck pattern in the strange map of the current event, and that is what makes it such powerful evidence. A normal heat wave is a moving thing, here today and gone in a few days as the weather progresses. But what we are watching is the opposite. Heat domes that have planted themselves over Europe and over America and refuse to budge day after day, while in between, the same locked wave pattern drags cold air down and drops snow on the Rockies in June. The persistence is the tell. The fact that these features are not moving, that they have stalled in place long enough to break records and run up death tolls, is the signature of a jet stream that has slowed and seized exactly as the Arctic amplification story predicts. The map is not just showing us where it is hot, it is showing us that the great river of air has stopped flowing the way it should. There is active scientific research and genuine scientific debate about exactly how strong this connection is, and I want to be honest about that rather than overstate it. The idea that Arctic warming is making the jet stream wavier and more prone to blocking is supported by a growing body of evidence, but it is still an area where scientists are arguing over the details and the magnitude. What is not in serious dispute is the broader picture. The atmosphere has more energy in it than it used to. The baseline temperature on which every heat wave builds is higher than it was decades ago. And so when a stuck pattern does form, the heat it produces is more extreme than the same pattern would have produced in a cooler world. You are loading the dice. You do not change the fact that it is a roll of the dice, but you change the odds, and you change what comes up when the dice land badly. And right now, the dice are loaded in another way too, out in the Pacific Ocean. The great climate pattern known as El Niño, which involves the warming of the tropical Pacific, is in a warming phase, with ocean temperatures climbing toward conditions that tend to push global temperatures higher still. We have covered the developing situation in the Pacific in detail in other recent videos, so I will not relitigate all of it here, but the relevant point is simple. The background state of the planet right now, the warmed oceans, the elevated baseline, the energy stored in the system, is primed to make any heat event hotter than it would otherwise be. The stuck jet stream provides the trigger. The warmed world provides the ammunition. There is one more piece of physics that I have to put in front of you here, because it connects the warming world directly back to the wet bulb temperature in a way that is almost too neat and too alarming to be a coincidence. There is a fundamental law of the atmosphere, worked out in the 1800s, that describes how much water vapor air can hold at a given temperature. The rule is simple. Warmer air can hold more moisture, and the relationship is steep, roughly 7% more water vapor for every single degree Celsius of warming. Now think about what that means for everything we have discussed. The wet bulb temperature, the thing that actually kills people, is driven by the combination of heat and humidity. And a warming planet does not just raise the heat. By this law, it also automatically loads the atmosphere with more moisture. So global warming is, in a very direct and physical sense, a wet bulb amplifier. It pushes up both halves of the equation at once, the heat and the humidity, and because wet bulb danger depends on both, the threat rises faster than the temperature alone would suggest. The same degree of warming that makes the air hotter also makes it wetter, and a hotter, wetter atmosphere is precisely the recipe for the lethal conditions we have been describing. It is worth pausing on the engine driving the Arctic's runaway warming too, because it is one of the most elegant and vicious feedback loops in all of nature. The Arctic is covered in ice and snow, which is bright white and reflects most of the sunlight that hits it straight back into space. but as the planet warms and the ice melts, it exposes the dark ocean and dark land underneath, which absorbs sunlight instead of reflecting it. That absorbed heat warms the region further, which melts more ice, which exposes more dark surface, which absorbs more heat. Round and round it goes, each turn accelerating the next. This is why the Arctic is warming several times faster than the rest of the planet, and it is why the temperature contrast that drives the jet stream is collapsing so quickly. The very mechanism that is supposed to keep the jet stream fast and orderly is being dismantled by a feedback loop at the top of the world, and the consequence of that dismantling is the slow, stuck, wave-riddled jet stream that parks killer heat over our cities. When you put those pieces together, the warming oceans, the moisture loading, the collapsing temperature gradient, the feedback-driven Arctic, you stop seeing a series of separate problems and start seeing a single integrated machine, every part of it pushing in the same direction, toward heat that is hotter, more humid, more persistent, and more lethal. This is why climate scientists who study these events, people like Friederike Otto of Imperial College London, whose field is specifically the science of attributing individual extreme events to climate change, say what they say with such consistency. They will tell you that heat waves of this intensity, and especially heat waves arriving this early in the season, are made substantially more likely and more severe by human-driven warming, and that without deep cuts to the emissions heating the planet, these events will keep getting worse. The science of event attribution has matured to the point where, after a heat wave like this, researchers can run the analysis and tell you, with real statistical rigour, how much more likely and how much hotter the event was made by climate change. And the answer, event after event, points in the same direction. So we now have our mechanism. A rapidly warming Arctic weakens the temperature contrast that drives the jet stream. The weakened jet slows down and develops huge stuck waves. Those stuck waves create blocking patterns that lock heat domes in place for days or weeks. And all of it unfolds on top of a planet whose baseline is already elevated and whose oceans are already primed so the heat that gets trapped is more extreme than ever. That is not a description of a freak event. That is a description of a machine that is being built and rebuilt every summer and tuned year by year toward more dangerous output. And once you understand that this is a machine and not an accident, the most frightening question is no longer about today, it is about the destination. Because if the wet bulb line is lower than we thought, and the heat machine is getting stronger every year, then somewhere out there is a threshold, the true 35-degree line, the point of no return where the human body simply cannot survive outdoors. And the unsettling truth is that we do not have to imagine what that looks like, because in a few corners of the planet, it has already happened. The line has already been crossed. Let me show you where. Part 8. The places that have already crossed the line. For all the talk of wet bulb temperature as a theoretical limit, a number on a chart describing some hypothetical future, there is a fact that tends to get buried, and it is one of the most sobering facts in this entire subject. The 35-degree wet bulb line, the true survival threshold, has already been crossed on Earth. Not in a climate model, not in a projection for the year 2070. In the real world in recent years, in places where real people live. Briefly, locally, for an hour or two at a time, the planet has already produced conditions in which an unprotected human being cannot survive, and it has done so more than once. The places where this has happened are not random. They cluster in a few specific regions that share a particular and deadly combination, intense heat layered on top of extreme humidity, usually where scorching land sits right beside warm seas. The shallow waters of the Persian Gulf are a textbook example. The Gulf is like a giant warm bath, and the air above it becomes saturated with moisture. And when that humid air drifts over the blazing hot coastlines of countries around the Gulf, you get the precise recipe for a lethal wet bulb spike. Researchers combing through weather station data have found that since around 2005, there have been at least 9 separate occasions in subtropical hotspots like this, where the wet bulb temperature briefly touched or exceeded that fatal 35-degree mark. One city has become almost a symbol of this future, and its name is Jacobabad in southern Pakistan. Jacobabad is regularly described as one of the hottest cities on the face of the earth, and it has crossed or brushed up against the wet bulb survival line on multiple documented occasions over the past decades. To live in a place like Jacobabad during its worst days is to live in a place where, for stretches of time, Simply being outside in the open air is incompatible with human life, where the only thing standing between a person and fatal hypothermia is a wall, a roof, and if they are lucky, a machine pumping cooled air. Think about what that means for the hundreds of thousands of people who live there, many of them poor, many of them without reliable electricity, let alone air conditioning. The theoretical limit of human survival is not theoretical to them. It is a weather forecast. It is worth understanding exactly why the Persian Gulf, of all places, became the first part of the world to brush the survival line, because the reason is a perfect, terrible illustration of the wet bulb principle. The Gulf is a shallow, enclosed body of water sitting under one of the hottest skies on Earth. The sun pours into it relentlessly, and because it is shallow and largely cut off from the cooler open ocean, its waters heat to bathtub temperatures, in some places approaching the heat of a warm swimming pool. That superheated sea then does what warm water always does. It evaporates, pumping staggering amounts of moisture into the air directly above it. So you end up with a region that has both halves of the lethal equation maxed out at the same time. Blistering air temperatures from the desert sun and extreme humidity from the overheated sea, the two ingredients of a deadly wet bulb spike combined in one place. When that hot, saturated air drifts on shore over the coastal cities, the wet bulb temperature can rocket toward the survival limit. The Gulf is, in effect, a natural machine for manufacturing exactly the conditions that the rest of the world is only beginning to taste. And it is worth sitting for a moment with what a day near that limit actually means for the people living through it, because it is so far outside ordinary experience that it can be hard to grasp. On such a day, stepping outside is not uncomfortable. It is, in the most literal sense, incompatible with life if you stay out long enough. The sweat pours off you and accomplishes nothing. There is no shade cool enough, no breeze that helps, no amount of water you can drink that changes the outcome, because the problem is not inside you, it is in the air itself, which has lost its ability to accept the heat your body is desperate to give away. Your only options are to find a cooled, sealed space, or to begin, slowly, to die. That is not a description of a possible future. That is a description of days that have already occurred in cities where millions of people live, and the only thing standing between those people and mass death on those days is the electricity that keeps the cooling running. There is a specific reading that haunts the researchers who study this. On the 31st of July in 2015, in the Iranian city of Bandar Mashar, on the coast of the Persian Gulf, the wet bulb temperature was recorded at 34.6 degrees Celsius, just shy of the 35-degree death line for an hour or less. And what makes that reading so chilling is everything we have already learned in this video. Because remember, the 35-degree figure is the old theoretical too high estimate. The newer research, measured on actual human bodies, suggests the real danger line for many people sits several degrees below that, which means a reading of 34.6 is not merely close to the edge. By the standard of the new science, by the standard of what real human bodies can actually endure, a wet bulb temperature in the mid-30s is already deep into lethal territory for the old, the sick, and the vulnerable. The line we thought was at 35, the line that 34.6 was almost touching, may in truth have already been well behind them. This is the bridge between the abstract and the immediate, and I want to make sure it lands. When you hear that Europe just had a day with 101 million people above 35 degrees of air temperature, your mind, trained by a lifetime of weather forecasts, files it as a very hot day. But now you know to ask the hidden question. What was the wet bulb temperature in those places? How much moisture was in that air? Because depending on the humidity, a region in southern Spain, or the humid corridors of the American southeast under the coming dome, can produce wet bulb conditions that, for the most vulnerable people, are already brushing against the kind of lethal threshold that Bandar Mashar touched in 2015. The death zone is not a foreign place. It is a set of conditions, and those conditions are creeping into more and more of the inhabited world, more and more often. And notice the cruel geography of who is affected first. The regions most exposed to these lethal wet bulb spikes, places like South Asia, the coast of the Persian Gulf, are among the most densely populated and in many cases among the poorest and least air-conditioned places on the planet. The people on the front line of this threat are precisely the people with the fewest resources to escape it. A wealthy person in a humid megacity can retreat into a sealed, cooled apartment and wait out the worst. A labourer who has to work outdoors to feed a family does not have that option, and it is on those bodies, the ones forced to stay out in the heat, that the wet bulb line draws its first marks. There is a trap built into the way we have chosen to defend ourselves against this threat, and the places that have already crossed the line reveal it starkly. Our entire strategy for surviving extreme heat in the modern world comes down to one thing: air conditioning. We retreat indoors, we seal the windows, and we let a machine pump the heat back out. And for those who have it, it works. But that strategy contains a hidden and dangerous dependency, because it only works as long as the electricity keeps flowing. In the very regions most exposed to lethal wet bulb conditions, the power supply is often least reliable, and demand during a heat wave is exactly when the grid is most likely to buckle. So you get the worst possible setup: a population that has come to depend entirely on cooling machines to stay below their survival line, living in a place where the heat is most extreme and the power most fragile, so that the moment the grid fails, millions of people are instantly thrown back onto the mercy of an environment that their unaided bodies cannot survive. Air conditioning has not removed the wet bulb threat. It has, in a sense, hidden it, stacked everyone's survival on top of a single fragile system, and made the consequences of that system failing more catastrophic than ever. And then there are the people who never had the machine to begin with, the ones for whom retreat indoors is not an option. Consider the outdoor labourer in a place like the Persian Gulf or South Asia, the construction worker, the farmer, the street vendor, the person who has to be outside in the worst of it to earn enough to live. For them, a wet bulb spike is not something to wait out in a cooled room. It is the air they have to keep working in. These are the bodies on which the lethal line draws its first marks, and there is a brutal injustice baked into that geography, because the people most exposed to this threat have, almost without exception, done the least to cause the warming that drives it. The labourer in Jacobabad did not fill the atmosphere with the carbon that is now turning his city into a place that periodically cannot sustain human life. He is simply the one standing where the consequences land first. The wet bulb threat is not distributed by fairness. It is distributed by humidity, by poverty, and by the cruel accident of where a person happens to have been born. So we have established that the line is real, that it has already been crossed, and that the heat machine driving the world toward it is strengthening every year. Which leaves the question that every honest look at this subject eventually has to confront. If this is where we are now, with the records falling weeks early, and the death tolls climbing, and the lethal threshold already touched in a few unlucky corners of the world, then where exactly is this heading? What do the maps of the coming decades actually show? And before we get there, I want to deal head-on with the voices, and there are many of them, who look at all of this and insist that it is not real at all, that the records are faked, or that something more sinister is being done to the sky above us. Because separating the genuine science from the noise is the only way to see clearly where we are actually going. Part 9. The theories and the maps of what comes next. Whenever an event like this unfolds, whenever the records fall and the maps turn red, a particular set of explanations starts circulating online, and I think it is worth taking them seriously enough to actually examine, rather than just waving them away. Because the people asking these questions are usually not foolish. They are looking at something genuinely extraordinary, 2 continents shattering records at the same time, and they are reaching for an explanation big enough to match it. The instinct is understandable. It is just that, when you follow the evidence, the explanations do not hold up, and the truth turns out to be both simpler and, in its own way, more frightening. The first idea you will hear is that the heat is being deliberately engineered, that governments or shadowy programs are manufacturing these heat domes through weather control, through cloud seeding, through some form of geoengineering written across the sky. And I understand the appeal of that idea, because a deliberate cause feels more manageable than an accidental one, but the physics simply does not allow it. The energy contained in a continental-scale heat dome is staggering, beyond anything human technology can generate or steer. There is no machine, no program, no fleet of aircraft, capable of creating or moving an atmospheric feature that large. Cloud seeding, the one real and modest weather modification technology we do have, can under the right conditions coax a little extra rain out of a cloud that was already going to rain. It cannot conjure a hemisphere spanning ridge of high pressure. The pattern we are seeing is fully and precisely explained by the jet stream dynamics We have already walked through the slowed river, the stuck wave, the blocking high. We do not need to invent a secret hand. The atmosphere is doing this on its own, for reasons we can actually measure. The second idea is that the records themselves are fake, that the thermometers are rigged, or that the readings are inflated by being placed near hot asphalt in cities, the so-called urban heat island effect. And here the answer is almost embarrassingly straightforward. National weather agencies are acutely aware of the urban heat island effect, and they correct for it. The records are not coming from a single thermometer next to a parking lot. They're coming from thousands of independent stations, run by dozens of different national agencies that do not coordinate with one another, including remote rural stations far from any city, and they all show the same signal at the same time. You cannot fake a record simultaneously across France, Spain, Portugal, Italy and Britain on instruments operated by competing governments, in a way that also happens to match satellite measurements from orbit. The simultaneity across independent networks is precisely what makes the data trustworthy. The third idea is gentler and in some ways more common. It is the shrug. It is the voice that says, "It has always been hot in the summer. This is nothing new. People are just soft now." And the data answers that one directly, because the whole point of an all-time record is that it is, by definition, hotter than anything in the measured past. When France records the hottest day in the entire history of French record-keeping, that is not a normal summer. When Britain breaks a June record that stood since 1976, that is not the way it has always been. And the giveaway is the timing. These records are not falling at the traditional peak of summer. They are falling in clusters, out of season, in May and June, which is exactly the fingerprint you would expect from a warming baseline and an earlier, more aggressive arrival of extreme heat. And then, because this is a channel about the sky in all its forms, there is one more idea I want to address with care, which is the notion that the sun is the culprit, that we are simply being cooked from above by a more active star. I have a real affection for that instinct, because the sun genuinely is the engine of nearly everything that happens in our atmosphere. But the numbers do not support it as the cause here. The sun's total energy output varies only by a tiny fraction of a percent over its cycles, far too little to account for the magnitude of what we are seeing, and more tellingly, a brighter sun would warm the whole planet fairly evenly. It would not carve out specific stuck domes of heat over Europe and America while dropping snow on the Rockies in the same week. That regional patchy lopsided pattern is the unmistakable signature of atmospheric dynamics, of the jet stream, not of the sun. The sun sets the stage. It is not the thing rearranging the furniture this week. There is one more version of the doubt worth addressing, because it is the most reasonable sounding of all, and it is the quiet suspicion that the authorities are simply exaggerating, that the red alerts and the emergency language are overblown, a bureaucracy covering itself crying wolf about a hot week. I understand the fatigue behind that thought, but look at the actual incentives and they run the other way. Public officials have every reason in the world to avoid panic, to keep economies running, to not shut down schools and cancel events and spook the public unless they truly believe they have to. The reflex of most institutions is to understate, not overstate, because overstating has costs and creates backlash. When the World Health Organization reaches for the phrase health emergency, when France shutters hundreds of schools, when a national weather service issues its highest tier of alert, these are not institutions hungry for drama. These are cautious bureaucracies being driven to act against their own instinct for calm by data they cannot ignore. The exaggeration theory gets the psychology exactly backwards. If anything, the steady drumbeat of excess mortality figures suggests the official response has been too slow and too modest, not too aggressive. What unites all of these theories, the engineering, the faked records, the "it has always been this way," the sun, the exaggeration, is that each one offers a kind of comfort. Each one lets you set the threat down. If it is engineered, someone could stop it. If it is fake, there is nothing to fear. If it is normal, we have survived it before. If it is the sun, it is out of our hands and not our doing. The real explanation offers none of that comfort, and I think that is precisely why it is the hardest one to accept. The truth is that this is real. It is us. It is physics, and it is getting worse on a schedule we can actually measure. There is no secret hand to blame, and no reassuring shrug available. There is only a machine we built, running hotter every year, and a survival line that turns out to be closer than we were told. So with the noise cleared away, we can look honestly at the maps of what comes next, and they are not comforting. Climate researchers have modelled where on Earth these lethal wet bulb conditions, the true survival threshold events, are likely to become regular features of life, and the projections fall into a grim sequence. By around the year 2050, the regions expected to start regularly crossing into dangerous wet bulb territory include South Asia, that vast and densely populated band across Pakistan, India and Bangladesh, along with the coast of the Persian Gulf and the shores of the Red Sea. Hundreds of millions of people live in exactly those zones. Then, looking further out, toward around 2070, the maps expand to include eastern China, parts of Southeast Asia, and portions of Brazil. These are not empty deserts. These are some of the most crowded places on the planet, and the projection is that within the lifetimes of people already born, they could face conditions where being outdoors during the worst of summer is, for hours at a time, simply not survivable. Sit with what those maps actually imply, because the dry language of climate projection hides something enormous. When researchers say a region will begin to regularly cross into dangerous wet bulb territory, they are describing a place that, for part of every year, becomes a place where human beings cannot reliably survive outdoors. And when a region reaches that state, the consequences ripple outward into everything. Agriculture, which depends on people working in the fields, becomes impossible during the worst stretches. Economies built on outdoor labour seize up, and ultimately people face a choice that has shaped human history again and again, which is whether to stay in a place that has turned against them or to leave. The polite scientific term for what these maps describe is reduced habitability. The blunter term is that parts of the world where vast numbers of people currently live could, within the lifetimes of children alive today, become places that periodically expel their own populations, simply because the air outside has crossed a line the human body cannot. And the cruelty of the timeline is that it runs faster for the most vulnerable than the headline dates suggest. The maps that say 2050 and 2070 are describing when these conditions become regular and widespread. But remember everything the new research told us. For the old, the sick, the very young, the lethal line sits lower, which means those populations reach dangerous conditions years or decades before the maps turn red for everyone else. The future arrives first for the frail, quietly, in individual deaths that get attributed to other causes, long before it announces itself as a regional catastrophe. By the time a place officially crosses the threshold, it will already have been killing its most vulnerable residents for a long time. That is the pattern we're watching the leading edge of right now, this week, in the excess mortality figures coming out of Europe. And here is the thread that ties it all back to this week, to the heatwave happening right now. Remember that the European event we are living through is not even the first of the year. Back in late May, just weeks ago, Europe was hit by an earlier record-shattering heatwave, one that pushed temperatures 10 to 15 degrees above normal and set all-time records for spring heat across multiple countries, with one Portuguese town reaching 40.3 degrees Celsius in May, a month when such a reading should be impossible. That May event killed people too, and then it faded. And now, barely a month later, here is the second and even more severe blow. 2 historic heat waves, back to back, before summer has even truly begun. That is what the shifting calendar looks like in real time. The season of dangerous heat is not just getting hotter, it is getting longer, arriving earlier and striking in waves, one after another, each one testing the limits a little more than the last. Which brings us finally to the question that has been waiting underneath this entire video. The question that the records and the death tolls and the lowered survival line and the strengthening heat machine all point toward together. If this is June, and the records are already falling, and the lethal threshold is closer than we believed, then what we are feeling right now cannot be the peak. So what is it? And the answer, once you really absorb everything we have covered, is the most unsettling idea of all. Part 10. The floor, not the ceiling. Let me bring us back to where we started, to the simple, deceptive number on the thermometer, because everything we have learned changes what that number means. When this all began, I told you the thermometer was lying to you, and now you understand exactly how. You understand that the air temperature leaves out humidity, and that humidity is what disables your body's only cooling system. You understand that there is a truer number, the wet bulb temperature, that measures how much survival margin you actually have left. You understand that the lethal line of that number sits lower than science believed for a century, and lower still for the old and the vulnerable. And you understand that the danger does its worst work not in the blazing afternoon, but in the quiet of nights that no longer cool. You will never read a summer forecast the same way again, and that is the point. But there is one final reframe, and it is the one I want to leave you with, because it is the true meaning of the title. We have a deep instinct, all of us, to look at an event like this and treat it as a peak, an extreme, a high watermark, the worst heat wave in memory, the hottest day on record. We file these things as ceilings, as the upper limit of how bad it can get, and we comfort ourselves that having survived the ceiling, we have seen the worst. But everything we have walked through today says that this instinct is exactly backwards. The heat that 2 continents are enduring right now, the records falling weeks before summer's peak, the death tolls climbing into the hundreds and the thousands, the survival line being quietly brushed in the most vulnerable populations, all of it is happening near the beginning of a trend, not the end of one. The Arctic will keep warming, the jet stream will keep slowing, the oceans will keep storing heat, the baseline will keep rising, and the machine that builds these heat domes will keep getting stronger, which means the most important thing to understand about this heat wave is also the simplest. It is not the ceiling, it is the floor. It is not the most extreme heat the world will ever see. It is closer to the least extreme heat it will see from here forward. The all-time record set in France this week is a number that, in the decades to come, will very likely be remembered not as an impossible extreme but as an ordinary summer day. The 100-degree reading in a British June, the thing that shattered a record standing since 1976, will become unremarkable. The conditions that are killing the elderly of Spain in their hundreds right now will become a routine feature of the season, year after year, unless the underlying engine is somehow slowed. I think the reason the floor and ceiling distinction matters so much is that it changes what you're supposed to do with the fear. If this heat wave were a ceiling, the right response would be to endure it, to get through the bad week and exhale when it passes, confident that you have seen the worst. But if it is a floor, then enduring is not enough, because the thing you are enduring is going to become the new normal, and then be surpassed, and then surpassed again. A ceiling asks for endurance, a floor asks for attention, for memory, for the refusal to let this become background noise. The most dangerous thing we could do with a summer like this one is to survive it and then forget it, to file it away as a bad year and move on, because that is exactly how a floor disguises itself as a ceiling, one forgotten record at a time, until the conditions that once shocked us are the conditions we expect. And I want to be clear that none of this is a counsel of despair, because the same understanding that makes this frightening is also what makes it something other than fate. Everything we have walked through, the stuck jet stream, the warming oceans, the rising baseline, the loaded atmosphere, all of it traces back to the same root cause, and that root cause is not a mystery, and it is not beyond reach. The machine that builds these heat domes is being fueled, and the fuel can be reduced. The trajectory of those maps, the 2050 and 2070 lines creeping across the inhabited world, is not fixed. It is a projection based on choices, and projections based on choices can be changed by different choices. The wet bulb line itself is fixed, set by the physics of the human body and beyond our power to move. But how close the world pushes toward it is not fixed at all. That part is still being written. I keep thinking about those 2 numbers that sit at the center of this whole story, because together they tell you everything. The first is 35 degrees, the wet bulb line we long believed marked the edge of human survival, the line we assumed was safely far away. The second is 30.5 degrees, the line that real human bodies, measured in a laboratory, actually broke at. The gap between those 2 numbers is the gap between the danger we prepared for and the danger that is actually here. We built our defences, our warnings, our sense of safety, around the higher number, and the lower number was the truth all along. We have been standing closer to the edge than we knew, on a planet that is walking us toward it a little faster every year. There is a concept that scientists who study this use, and it is the quiet horror underneath the maps of the future. It is the idea of an adaptation limit. For most of human history, we have adapted to heat through behaviour and technology, by shifting our hours, by building shade, by inventing cooling. And we tell ourselves, reasonably, that we will keep adapting, that human ingenuity will find a way. but the wet bulb temperature describes a hard wall that ingenuity cannot move, because it is not a limit of our technology or our cleverness. It is a limit of human physiology itself, a fixed property of the carbon and water that we are made of. You cannot innovate your way past the point where your body physically cannot shed heat. You can hide from it behind a wall in a machine for as long as the machine runs, but you cannot make your body able to survive in air it was never built to survive in. That is what makes the wet bulb threshold different from almost every other climate threat. It is not a challenge to be managed. It is a boundary on where human beings can physically exist, and the maps of the coming decades show that boundary creeping into places where, today, hundreds of millions of people live their entire lives. And I keep coming back to the most quietly devastating fact in all of this, which is that the heat we are living through right now is not even the worst Europe has seen this single year. It is the second wave. The first one came in May, weeks ago, breaking spring records that should have been untouchable, and then it faded, and people exhaled and thought the worst was behind them. And here is the second, larger blow, before the calendar has even reached the heart of summer. That pattern, wave after wave, each one arriving earlier and hitting harder, with brief deceptive lulls in between, is what the future actually looks like. Not one apocalyptic day, but an extended season of repeated assaults, each one testing the limits a little further, each one falling hardest on the same vulnerable people, with the gaps between them too short for real recovery. The season of dangerous heat is not just getting hotter, it is getting longer at both ends and denser in the middle, and that is change every bit as deadly as the peak temperatures themselves. So when you step outside this week, into whatever piece of this hemispheric heat has reached you, whether it is the European furnace or the American dome, I want you to feel the thing this video has really been about. Not just the heat on your skin, but the meaning underneath it. Feel that you're standing inside a record, and understand that the record is temporary, that it is a marker the world is going to pass and leave behind. Feel that the number on the thermometer is the gentle version of the truth, and that the truer number, the one your body answers to, is closer to its limit than it appears. And understand that the most honest name for what is happening right now is not a disaster, or an extreme, or a freak event. The most honest name for it is a preview. Think back over everything we have traced today, and notice how each piece made the danger larger than the one before it. We started with the records, France's hottest day ever, Britain's hottest June, and they seemed extraordinary on their own. Then we learned that the air temperature behind those records is the gentle version of the truth, that the real measure of danger is the wet bulb temperature, which folds in the humidity that disables the body's only defense. Then we learned that the lethal line of that truer number sits lower than science believed for a century, closer to ordinary conditions, and lower still for the vulnerable. Then we saw that the killing happens most in the nights that no longer cool, and that those nights are breaking records too. Then we traced the broken jet stream and the warming oceans that are making these events stronger and more frequent, and then we saw that the line has already been crossed in a few corners of the world, and that the maps show it spreading. At every step, the threat turned out to be larger and closer than it looked the step before. That is the real architecture of this story. It is not one shock. It is a series of revelations, each one pulling the danger nearer. And that is exactly why the title is not hyperbole. The heat hitting the world right now really is far worse than you think, and it is worse in a layered, compounding way that a single number could never capture. It is worse than the thermometer says, because of the humidity. It is worse than the daytime suggests because of the nights. It is worse than the textbook claimed because of the lowered limit. It is worse than this week implies because this week is a floor and not a ceiling. Each of those is true on its own, and stacked together they describe an event and a trajectory far graver than the headline number that most people will carry away from this summer. The thermometer gave you one frightening number. Everything underneath it is more frightening still. The heat hitting the world right now is far worse than you think. Not because of how high the thermometer climbed this week, but because of how much higher it is going to climb in all the weeks, and summers, and decades still ahead, and because the line past which the human body cannot follow is closer than any of us were told. This is not the ceiling we have finally reached. It is the floor we are only just beginning to leave, and the question that should keep all of us watching the sky is no longer whether the heat will get worse. It is how much of the world and how many of the people in it will still be able to step outside when it does,